What is annexation? You may have heard that word used a lot lately, as Israel's government prepares to make major moves in the occupied West Bank. Backed by a controversial proposal by the Trump administration, opposed by both Palestinian leadership and the international community, Israel could take over up to a third of Palestinian land, putting decades of peace talks in jeopardy. So what is it, and what would it look like?
We are at a watershed moment. If implemented, annexation would constitute the most serious violation of international law. I call on the Israeli government to abandon its annexation plans.
Annexation, as it's defined, is when one state extends formally its sovereignty over an area of land that sits outside its dominion, usually by force. Israel has already done this before, taking over East Jerusalem in 1980 and the Golan Heights from Syria in 1981, declaring both part of Israeli territory. By contrast, Israel has extended political and security control over the West Bank since 1967 in the form of a military occupation, where it has set up military outposts, checkpoints, and more than 200 residential settlements where 600,000 Jewish settlers now live. All of this in violation of international law and in the face of widespread and repeated condemnation. Now it wants to move further, annexing the resource-rich Jordan Valley, which makes up nearly a third of the West Bank, as well as all its settlement blocks. This would not only deprive Palestinians of vital regional resources like water, farmland, and the Dead Sea, it would also geographically isolate what's left of the West Bank from the rest of the world.
Annexation is one of the most fundamental abridgments of international law.
This is Zaha Hassan, a human rights lawyer who was also a senior advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team at the UN.
Annexation and the colonization of another country is set out in the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's considered not just a war crime, population transfer and ethnic cleansing, it's considered a crime against humanity.
Right-wing elements of Israeli society, including Israel's president Reuven Rivlin, have called multiple times for annexing the West Bank. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised it multiple times over the last several elections, only to walk it back after international backlash. But what's changed this time is the shifting role of the United States, Israel's long-term partner in the region, and the shocking proposal presented by Donald Trump in January, the so-called deal of the century.
Peace requires compromise, but we will never ask Israel to compromise its security. Can't do that. We are asking the Palestinians to meet the challenges of peaceful coexistence. Jerusalem will remain Israel's undivided, very important, undivided capital.
Back in 2016, the UN Security Council passed a resolution declaring that all settlement construction by Israel in the West Bank and East Jerusalem had no legal validity, and warned it to halt construction. That resolution passed because the United States abstained from the vote instead of vetoing it, as it had done so over the last 40 years. The Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, said this:
"It is not this resolution that is isolating Israel. It is the permanent policy of settlement construction that risks making peace impossible."
Fast forward to 2019, and the current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said this:
"The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law."
That was a stark shift in US policy, following other unilateral moves to recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem as Israeli land. It also paved the way for what was to come, the officially named Peace to Prosperity Blueprint. The proposal, spearheaded by Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, was immediately accepted by the Israelis.
"I've agreed to negotiate peace with the Palestinians on the basis of your peace plan."
That proposal gave Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and all illegal settlement blocks. It offered the Palestinians small pockets of land in Israeli territory and the potential for a future Palestinian state when they could prove they were ready for it. Palestinian leaders, who accused the US of alienating them from the very beginning, unsurprisingly rejected the plan.
Trump peace plan basically decided that the Palestinians were irrelevant in determining their future. No sovereignty for Palestinians because Israel would retain security control over the entirety of the West Bank. and no removal of any settlers. Israel now feels emboldened because of the green light it's received from the US.
So what would this actually mean on the ground? To begin with, not much will change. Palestinians living in these areas are already under military occupation, facing ongoing raids, arrests, and restrictions on their freedom of movement. But the fate of the nearly 70,000 Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley would be in question. Neither Israel's government or Trump's plan have indicated that these Palestinians would be offered Israeli citizenship or granted equal rights. It could also deny Palestinians access to the Jordan border, through which the majority travel in and out of the West Bank. For many Palestinians, annexation would spell the end of any hopes for a two-state solution, the end of the possibility of a Palestinian state.
We're dealing with an Israeli government that has made perfectly clear what their intentions are for the Palestinians. In 2018, Israel passed a quasi-constitutional law that basically provided that Palestinians have no legal or historic or national claims to the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Only Jewish people are entitled to self-determination anywhere Israel extends its sovereignty.
The Palestinian Authority has already severed many bureaucratic ties with Israel and warned that it could escalate the situation if annexation goes ahead. Internationally, countries like France, Germany, and Egypt have vocally opposed the move. The EU warned of significant consequences to Israel, and Jordan said the move would lead to massive conflict. Israel's government is itself divided on the timing and detail of annexation, with Netanyahu and his reluctant coalition partner and political rival Benny Gantz butting heads publicly and privately. Opinion polls show the Israeli public is also split on whether it should go ahead at all. Even Trump's administration, facing an election in November, has remained uncharacteristically quiet on whether it will support its Israeli partner as it had done in the past.
Israel needs to be treated as any other state would be treated if it was about to engage in annexation of another country. We've seen this in other political contexts in terms of the Ukraine, in terms of Cyprus. You either oppose these Israeli policies or you don't, and then you become complicit. And the international community, needs to take a stand in this regard.
Faced with the coronavirus pandemic and mounting pressure both internationally and within his own government, Netanyahu appears determined and defiant, promising to carry out one of the main campaign policies that helped him remain in power. But when that happens, how will the international community respond? Thank you for watching. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. This is obviously a very complicated and evolving situation, and we are continuing as a team at Middle East Eye to cover it from all aspects, all sides, and all perspectives.